Hello and welcome to episode 81 of the Ego Chall Podcast. My name is Preston Byers, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host Justin Binkowski. And on today's episode, we are discussing the fifth and final major of the 2023 CDL season, which happened this past weekend in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. And it was a pretty fire major, to be honest. A lot of things happened. We had a lot of storylines going into it. Not all of those storylines ended up playing out how we hoped or thought they would, but it was an interesting event nonetheless to finish out the CDL regular season. And now we are on to champs, but not quite, because we still got to go over the major, talk about some of the things that happened, what teams finished in the top 8 and are now heading to Las Vegas in 2 weeks for champs. But before we get to any of that, how are you doing, Bink?
Doing all right. Was telling you, Taco Bell chalked my order for tonight, but we got some good COD to talk about, so hopefully it'll make up for it.
Yeah. Let's get right into it. I'll pull up the bracket on the screen. So if you're watching on YouTube or if you wanted to watch on Twitch, maybe next week, twitch.tv/Ego Chall Podcast, I'll pull up the bracket so anybody watching the videos can see who was doing what at the major. Of course, like always, this is a best of 5, or excuse me, all series are best of 5, but I was more saying it's a double elimination bracket. So the top 8 teams from the qualifiers could lose a match realistically and make it still to the grand finals, which did turn out to be true in this case, as the New York Subliners, the Major 1 champions. They started the season with a major victory. They ended the season with a major victory. They're the only team this season to win multiple majors. We had 4 different major winners this season, with New York repeating with Major 1 and Major 5. A really, really impressive run through the losers bracket. 3 straight sweeps to start the losers bracket, and then beat the Toronto Ultra in Game 5, sweep the Minnesota Rocker, and then a best of 7 that actually went to 7 with Atlanta FaZe. Just an incredible event for the Subliners, who came out on top in a very contentious final series against FaZe. Just your general thoughts. Obviously, we'll go more into depth with some of these specific series, but what did you think overall of the Subliners after losing to Toronto in the first round to come back through the losers bracket and win the title?
Yeah, I thought I didn't write it down in the notes or find the specific tweet either, but I thought, obviously Thursday feels like a month ago at this point, but that first matchup between Toronto and New York I thought was super close. It was a hard-fought series, and I think one of the New York guys ended up tweeting like they felt like they threw the series on their end and that they could have won it. So I think after that they were able to go on a string of matches against, not necessarily the toughest teams, but in the context of what was on the line and how some of those teams that were playing, it was a little surprising to see them go 3-0, 3-0, 3-0 to start the losers bracket run. And then they get that rematch with Toronto and they actually win this one in the end to go on to another 3-0 leading into the grand finals. And the biggest surprise for me, just in the grand finals, without getting too in-depth, was that, obviously, like you said, this was the first time it went to a Game 7 this year, finals did, which means that there was 3 search and destroys played in the finals, and we've obviously sung FaZe's praises and search and destroy multiple times on this podcast this year, but New York won all 3 search and destroys in the grand finals, proving the age-old adage of S&D wins championships. So for New York to do that against FaZe, who I don't know if you can even say, arguably, they've been the best search and destroy team for a majority of this year. So that was really impressive in my eyes, and I think the bigger conversation post-event too was that in my eyes, and seemingly in the eyes of a lot of people in the community, Hydra has to be considered the front runner for season MVP now, just because he has 2 titles and 1 individual MVP, tournament MVP this year. Obviously, only New York players will have 2 titles, and Kismet, I believe, won MVP at Major 1. So this was just a big tournament for ramifications for the season overall MVP as well. Hydra played lights out all weekend, but if FaZe took this one, we were probably talking about one of the FaZe guys, most likely a BZ, being the front runner for MVP of the season, and some people still might argue that he could be, depending on like the stats and whatnot. But I think Hydra has a leg up on everybody now, just due to the fact, like I said, those 2 championships and the individual MVP for a tournament.
Yeah, I definitely think the Hydra MVP campaign has really gotten a boost this past week, and I think a lot of people thought, whichever team kind of won their second major at Major 5, or if like another team won their first major, like then that whoever won that might be like the MVP of this season, because everything has been kind of so even. Like I said, we had 4 different major winners coming into this event. So you could make an argument for any of those 4 teams' best players of like, oh, they deserve that, they deserve this. I know Celium has been kind of a candidate like just throughout the season because he had such a strong beginning of the year. But New York had been kind of like, not like bad or anything, but definitely not among the elite teams. Like we weren't really talking a lot about them heading into this major. We haven't really been talking a lot about Hydra, at least us. I'm not really saying like the community as a whole, but we, maybe that's a blind spot for us, that we weren't talking a ton about Hydra in New York coming into this, because they had been good but not great. They hadn't really done anything exceptional over the past few months. They had seemed to kind of been capped out. Like they didn't seem to be able to get over the hump and beat some of like the best teams consistently. So that's not so they weren't really on my radar coming in, but they proved me wrong. They proved a lot of people wrong. I did pick them to win the major final, but I didn't see the S&D thing coming like at all. Like I knew that the majority, or not the majority, but the plurality of the best of 7 is S&D. 3 of the 7 maps are search and destroy in the grand finals of these majors. And I knew that FaZe was a better search and destroy team, or I thought that they were. But I figured that the respawn would actually be what would swing it in New York's favor, particularly Hardpoint and Control was kind of hit or miss with FaZe. I figured, oh, okay, like we'll get a respawn heavy series from New York. FaZe will win some of those S&Ds, and then maybe if New York can steal a search and just pick up those respawns, that could be the difference. It turned out that was like not the case at all. And that's shocking to me. In all honesty, like FaZe split the hard points. FaZe won both of the controls, but then they lose 6-2 in the first search. They lose a round 11 on LSEO in map 5, and then they lose the last map 6-3 on Mercado. And honestly, 6-3 seems like pretty close, because that map was very much in favor of New York. Like they dominated.
They're up 5-1.
Yeah, like they kind of costed a few maps and or a few rounds, but it was a very one-sided search, and it was kind of shocking to see, in all honesty. But yeah, a lot of credit to New York. Like this is an incredible run. They definitely helped their standing or their seeding as well. They jumped Toronto. I believe they might have jumped LAT and Toronto at this event, because I'm trying to think of, so they got 65 points, Toronto got 30, LAT got 20. So they were, I believe that, yeah, so I think they jumped LAT and Toronto. For the 3rd seed, they were in 5th, which means that they would have probably played like LAT at that point. But now they have a much more favorable first round matchup for winners or for the winners bracket of champs, which is, it can't be understated or overstated that is a gigantic advantage to avoid LAT or avoid Toronto in round one and get a Minnesota is their matchup. So but yeah, we'll get to the champ stuff probably more next week. We'll touch on it a little bit today, but we don't we have a lot to cover with Major 5, and we'll focus more on that, and we have a few weeks before we get to the champs event, and we get to really talk about that kind of stuff. Where do you want to go next? Do you want to? We've kind of talked a little bit about New York FaZe in the grand finals. Anything specifically that jumped out to you that caught your eye as you were watching Major 5 this weekend?
I think it just needs to be stated how strong FaZe looked in their matches before the grand finals. Literally a 9-1 map count. We kind of touched on it last week, how Vegas kind of got the short end of the stick with the bracket draw, and even given their current form in online play and stuff, maybe we weren't necessarily looking at an absolute 3-0 slacking, but that's what FaZe delivered. And then they come out and beat the home team in front of their fans pretty convincingly in that series as well. And then the hard points were close, and it was a 6-5 in the search that Toronto won, but the 3-0 and the control is what stuck out to me. Just we've talked about control, not necessarily, we talked about Respawn with FaZe and all that stuff, but I think control wasn't necessarily a great move for them either. But they had some flashes of control brilliance throughout this weekend. They had a 3-0 against Rocker. Where would their match again? It was a 3-1 against Vegas, so they went 9-1 in control rounds too before the grand finals. And they did win both controls in the grand finals as well, 3-1s and 3-2. So that's of note. That good time to be figuring that out. But obviously, the bigger storyline for FaZe, despite how strong they played leading up to the grand finals, is just the fact they lost 3 searches to New York in the finals there. And I will, just before we start going to other teams too, it should be stated, I think Nameless was being a strong pioneer of the desk of this potentially being the greatest losers bracket run of all time. Before this before the grand finals match, New York had 5 wins and 4 of them were 3-0s. Like, it was just a pretty dominant run. You think about earlier this year too, that Thieves had a strong losers bracket run from round 1, but they weren't able to get the job done in the grand finals. So, and I know the LAG did it last year. I believe it was from round 1 in loser bracket. I just don't remember the round counts, but I know they won a lot of searches, so there might have been some 3-2s in there as well. Nonetheless, this is just a really impressive run out of New York, and I wanted to emphasize that it was very dominant. And even though, in both cases, outside New York obviously lost 3 maps in the first round. So even if you count that, they had a 17 and 5 map count going into the grand finals, 15-2 in losers bracket, and then FaZe was 9-1 map count going into grand finals. So it was just a collision course of 2 teams that were playing some really good Call of Duty, and that showed in the end product. It was just a really hard fought grand finals, and I wouldn't mind seeing another showdown between these squads at champs if that's how the bracket works out.
Yeah, so LAG was 7-1 in search in their 5 loser bracket matches at last year's Major 2, and then they beat FaZe 5-2 in the grand final as well. But as far as FaZe goes, and I'll speak on FaZe first before I talk about New York's loser bracket run. But FaZe, just super dominant. I know that we talked about last week how like the lower half of the winners bracket was kind of like very tough because you had FaZe, Toronto, and New York, and you didn't know exactly what Vegas was going to bring. If they were on their best game, it could be a really tough kind of 4-team group essentially. Whereas you looked at the top and you're like, well, OpTic's definitely going to roll through these teams like Florida, Boston, Minnesota. Like, OpTic has a much easier path to winners finals, whereas someone like FaZe, they have a very tough path to get to winners finals, and it just turned out to be the complete opposite, or at least FaZe made it seem that like the complete opposite, because they rolled through Vegas, they beat Toronto, they rolled through Minnesota, and and their search was not great, obviously, in the grand final, but I don't know how much can be taken away from that as like that they're weak or anything in that game mode, because they were 2-1 in it heading into the grand final in the first 3 matches. Obviously, you don't get to play a ton of S&D if you keep 3-0ing and 3-1ing teams, but the control and the hard point to a degree was impressive from FaZe, that they were able to win those. They were 4-0 in hard point and 3-0 in control heading into the grand final at Major 5, but they obviously didn't have as strong or as perfect of a run in the grand final. As far as New York, I think the LAG losers bracket run was probably more improbable. It seemed more ridiculous that they were able to do that, because I believe that was Spart's first event with LAG, and it just seemed like how does this team of all of these teams make this run? Whereas New York, I think they wouldn't be your first pick to make that type of run, but they're still a very talented team. They won a major. They've been one of the top 4 or 5 teams all season long. So it's not as ridiculous as LAG. And I think it looks more ridiculous, the LAG run, in hindsight, because they were awful after that. Like they were, I think I said they were like the worst team or the second worst team behind Paris after that tournament. And it just kind of went to crap as soon as they left that major. But yeah, it's still
as soon
crazy.
As the Volk got GA'd.
Yeah, pretty much. But Spart still got his bag, and RCD's got his bag in the off season. So whatever. And Slasher ended up on FaZe, so it all ended up working out.
Except for LAG.
Yeah, things have not been great for them this season. But yeah, like I think it's up there as far as loser bracket runs go. I can't really think of any loser bracket runs off the top of my head before the CDL, except for like 100 Thieves at Champs, I think, one year.
And that's the first one that comes to my mind is Team Envy at Ghost Champs. They made it from loser bracket round 1, I believe, to the finals, but even they lost. And 100 Thieves in that comeback you were talking about at Black Ops 4 Champs, they ended up losing to United. So there's been a lot of really good losers bracket runs that didn't actually fully realize. There was one, I think it was CWL Seattle, which would have been Rise Nation. They won 2 best of 5s coming from the loser bracket round 1 to win the tournament. I would have to look at what their map count was, but that one does jump to mind too, because that was Slasher versus Aches back in World War II.
Yeah, I mean, there aren't a lot of, like, there are more like, oh, that was a good losers bracket run, but a lot of times they fall short. I mean, traditional sports, we just saw the Celtics come back from 3-0 and then losing Game 7. That's kind of a pretty apt comparison to COD, where a lot of these teams are able to make it to grand finals or get close, but they can't get over the hump. And it's in past years, it would have been an advantage for the winners bracket team. Like, you would only have to win 1 best of 5 versus the losers bracket team would have to win 2. We don't have that in the CDL, so it's a little more realistic to make it, but it still hasn't happened very often. In New York, being they had a really tough road. Like let's just go through their losers bracket real quick. Like, they 3-0 LAG, like, kind of pretty obvious. Like, everyone knew that, or everyone thought that the loser of Toronto and New York dropping down to play LAG, that was in like an automatic W for whoever lost. Then they played Vegas. I mean, they tore our hearts out. We'll talk about it, but they 3-0'd Vegas, which is still impressive considering Vegas had beaten them in the qualifiers just before this major. They 3-0'd Florida. Not like super surprising, but Florida did 3-0 OpTic, so it's it's still a very good win. The Toronto one is the most impressive in my mind, at least in the losers bracket. They had lost to Toronto 3-2 in winners bracket round 1, and then they come back and they beat Toronto 3-2 in the losers bracket semis, to get to losers bracket finals and to get to to the top 3. They beat Minnesota. They sweep them 3-0, which, I don't think either one of us were very surprised at that result, especially with how well New York had been playing to that point. And then they won 4-3 in the grand finals. Just overall, just an incredible losers bracket run. I think it's easy to say like, oh, that's the greatest losers bracket run of all time, in the moment, because it's kind of recency bias. You're just thinking like there aren't that many, and they did it. They won. It's a pretty rare thing, but it's definitely one of the best. And it came at the perfect time. We talked about it with LAT last season. When you turn up and you're at your best at the very end of the regular season, heading into champs, that is the perfect time to be at your best, because this is this event coming up is the most important of the season. It might be the most important event of some of these guys' lives, and they could change their lives, change their careers with a win in 2 weeks, and they're playing incredible Call of Duty at the right time, and kudos to them. I also just think like New York in general, like this team had so much drama after last season. For them to have one of the best regular seasons, be the only 2-time major champions this season, is really a testament to like what they built there. Hydra obviously was at the center of like whatever controversy. It might be overblown to say it's a controversy, but just like kind of drama. He was at the center of that at the end of last season. D-Real, the coach, was kind of at the center of that drama as well. They kept Kismet, and I think the more I watched Kismet this weekend, I was like, this guy might be one of the smartest COD players in the world. Like his map positioning is like incredible. He seems to know what to do like every single time. And I don't think like that's going to show up on a stat sheet, and I don't think he's going to be who people think of all the time about like, oh, who's a really good COD player. But their success is kind of like tied to him, right? Because they weren't a very good team before he came to lineup last season, and then they became one of the better teams in the league. And this season they've been in the top 5 all season long, and now have 2 major championships to their credit. A lot of credit. And I think it's weird too, because we talked about it last week, but they used Wardy as their sub for their last regular season match, and we were kind of talking about like what are the benefits, kind of the pros and cons, or like was that the right move? I mean, it turned out like it didn't actually matter. Like it just is basically load management essentially. They pulled it off. They did everything right. If you're playing by the results, so credit to them. We talked about FaZe, we talked about New York. Let's talk about Minnesota a little bit, just because they did finish 3rd. I am admittedly not as like over the moon about their result. It was the result that they needed. They did everything they could to make champs, and they did that. So like all credit to them, because they were in jeopardy, especially if they had dropped to Boston in round 1. We saw how well London, if you want to say Boston played poorly as well, but London ended up winning that losers bracket round 1 match that I thought was like an automatic W for whoever dropped down. So like it's realistic that Minnesota could have lost to them, and then everything could have went to crap for them, especially with Vegas winning. But Minnesota ended up getting top 3 at a major where not a lot of people would have predicted them to even get top 4. They beat Boston 3-2 in round 1. Then they swept Florida, and then they got swept by FaZe, and then got swept by New York. Still really impressive, but I also think like it's more of a top 3 of the moment, or by circumstance, not really on like merit so much. I don't think they were one of the best 3 teams at this major. I don't think they're one of the best 3 teams heading into champs, but they're in a better shot or a better position now than they were heading into Toronto. So credit to them. What do you think of Minnesota?
Yeah, I'm right there with you. I think you can't really discredit them. They beat the teams put in front of them, and they lost to the teams that made it to the finals. Um, when they didn't win. So,
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, it's kind of weird to think about it that they actually came in third because, like you said, I definitely don't think they're the third best team in the game right now. I don't think I would be surprised if they get third again at champs. But,
Mm,
um, like you said, kudos to them, especially going up against Boston. That was a big win for them in terms of like the points between them and kind of solidifying themselves for champs. And then they play a Florida team that we'll talk about OpTic later, but Florida coming off a massive upset against OpTic. This was basically Florida's champs because they're not going to champs. That's their
yeah.
last tournament, so they were playing with nothing to lose. Rocker kind of didn't really have anything to lose at that point because they had qualified the champs with the win against Boston, I believe.
Yeah.
So that could have been a dangerous match, but they came out and took care of business there, which was good to see. But then again, they get 3-0'd by FaZe, 3-0'd by New York, which are the 2 finalists, but not even winning a map there. Kind of just puts them in that place in my mind where it's like, okay, yeah, they got third. Congrats, that's a great placing, and you get some nice paydays from this major. But I would be surprised too if we see a similar run out of them at champs, especially just based on the caliber of the team. Because obviously they could play Boston again, but they won't have a chance to play against a team like Florida. So, and I think major kudos to Attach and just the Minnesota camp in general. They made this last second change, replacing a guy like Afro who has superstar potential. I was very skeptical of just how the change would work. I admittedly didn't know much about Fame from Challengers even beforehand when they signed him, but I saw a lot of stuff on the TL. It felt like that he was more of a more aggressive sub player in Challengers before being brought up to the Rocker main roster. So this move to get Attached back in the lineup kind of like unleashed Fame, if you want to say that. And I felt like I saw some positive plays out of him with a sub in his hand. So I don't know. I just think in general this is a really good result for the Rocker, just in terms of everything going on, and especially making a very late change and not being able to practice with this set of 4, all that yada yada. But end of the day, I think unless they just continue to get better over this little break period, I'd be very surprised to see them end the season with another top 3 finish.
Yeah, I think the most impressive part about Minnesota was the qualifiers, because beating Toronto and LAT in the qualifiers was like huge for them. I can't be like overstated how big of wins those were, even if LAT were like not at their best or not playing their best. It's nothing Minnesota can do about that. But winning those 2 matches, regardless of the caliber or kind of the state of those teams, like that's huge, because that pretty much gave them the buffer that they needed to kind of pull away from Vegas, get into winner's bracket, and ultimately beat Boston and secure their spot at champs. So fair play to Minnesota. Congrats. They barely missed out on champs last season. That was a very disappointing result for them, and it didn't happen again. They were able to get the 6th seed, which is a lot better than I thought they would, considering they have been in 8th for like the past month and a half and kind of been just clinging on to 8th for pretty much that entire time. Next, we have Toronto, finished top 4. They were definitely like the 3rd best team at this major. They obviously beat New York, who ended up winning the major. They lose to New York in the losers bracket 3-2. They lost to FaZe, the other grand finalist, in the winners semis 3-1. So when you split series with the eventual champions, you lose in 4 to the other grand finalist. I think it's a pretty fair assumption that you were a very, very tough opponent at this major. They ended up beating LAT in the losers bracket 3-0, which was not like surprising, but I was not expecting that 3-0, especially since LAT had 3-0'd OpTic, then 3-0'd London, and they had some momentum building. LAT has been known to have some of these very strong loser bracket runs, and I was a little concerned for Toronto that it might happen again, but they shut it down really quick, and it was a pretty controlled win from them. Your thoughts on Toronto, who I believe are now the 4 seed and will have a rematch with LAT at Champs?
Yeah, not to get too far ahead of ourselves, but that match immediately when I saw the Champs bracket just immediately jumped out to me. That should be a good first round one. But it is a little weird just because of the way the bracket worked out here. That Toronto technically went 2-2 at the tournament, and they would have, a 5-5 map count against New York, and then 4-3 against FaZe and LA Thieves. So, pretty close to 500 map count, and obviously a 2-2 record in series count. But like you said, I really did feel like, saying they were the third best team at this tournament probably isn't too much of an overstatement. And I think that really, in my mind at least, boils down to how they played against New York, and just I wrote it down in the notes even before New York won the whole thing, that I thought it was really interesting how close both series were between Toronto and New York. The fact they were both 3-2s, each team, winning one or the other. So 5-5 map count against each other at this tournament. And again, we've talked about the game and stuff like that multiple times. It could come down to the nature of the game, but I just really think it's a testament to the talent on both teams, and just, and any team can kind of win on it any day if they're firing on all cylinders. But I was just really, I don't think surprised is the right word, but I really did like to see just how competitive that matchup was, and the fact we got to see it twice. I probably wouldn't have the same mindset if, even if New York, if New York 3-0'd Toronto in the loser bracket, that would have been 12 straight maps for them, so that would have kind of just been, mind-blowing. But, if it wasn't a 3-2 the second time around, I maybe wouldn't have the same mindset on the closeness of the two teams. But I just think that really did open some eyes for me, and I would love to see another showdown between them at Champs.
Yeah, so their head-to-head, Toronto and New York, before the major, Toronto was 3-1 against New York, with the only loss, coincidentally, of Toronto's coming in Major 1. So Toronto's eliminated from Major 1 by New York in a 3-2 series. And it ends up being the same here as well, where New York eliminates Toronto 3-2. But still, Toronto 4-2 on the season against New York. But I think they're 1-2 or maybe 2-2, I believe, at the majors. So it's kind of hard to see, they seem to be pretty even across the board. Toronto has the advantage in all of the game modes, but it's been, they're 6-5 in hardpoint, 5-4 in search, and then they're 5-1 in control. So that seems to be the game mode that they have the advantage, but that's still a pretty much 50-50 at that point. If you're splitting hard points, you're splitting searches, it can go either way. And I think we deserve another New York-Toronto series at Champs. It's going to be more difficult because they're on opposite sides of the bracket as the 4-5, or as the 4 for Toronto. And then you have the third seed, New York. They're not, going to match up in round 2 if they win. So they'd have to get to the winners finals or meet in the losers bracket to meet again. But I think we deserve that. It would be a really great way to end the season to have two of those teams play each other. But yeah, I think Toronto, I think I picked them to win this major, if I'm not mistaken, as my non-OpTic pick, of course, which, a lot of the commentary we had last week has just been thrown out the window, and it looks really stupid in hindsight. But
I think it's time we just talk about them.
Greenwall, please cover your ears. You were covering your eyes for most of Major Five, or not most because they were out pretty quickly. But OpTic Texas, the prohibitive favorites to win Major Five, the runners-up of Major Three and Major Four, a team that went undefeated in the Major Four and Major Five qualifiers. They were on track to take away Atlanta FaZe's number one seed heading into champs with a good result here, and it just crumbled. The Green Wall, an absolute shambles after a tumultuous weekend in Toronto. They played the Florida Mutineers, who, I remind you, not qualified for champs. They were mathematically eliminated when this Toronto major kicked off. That did not matter to either team, apparently, because the Florida Mutineers wiped them off the face of the earth pretty much. It was very one-sided. The Florida Mutineers won 3-0, dropping OpTic to the losers bracket, which I just briefly mentioned last week, how we had the very slim possibility that we would get OpTic versus LAT in the losers bracket round one. I thought it was very, very, very slim because OpTic, I thought, would easily beat Florida, and then we'd get Florida LAT, a pretty nothing match in losers round one. Turns out OpTic LAT, the HBR Classic, meets again in losers round one, and it was very one-sided once again. LAT sweeps OpTic, knocking them out of the tournament with 0 match wins, 0 map wins, 0 CDL points, and completely halts OpTic's momentum as we head into the most important tournament of the season. Bink, what did you in the Binkowski household, how stunned were you watching OpTic lose this weekend?
Oh, completely mind blown, for lack of a better term. The nameless GIF where he's just like that. That's what immediately comes to mind. I think it should be mentioned, just because we haven't talked about it, that Karma was basically announced as a coach for OpTic heading in on the actual first day of the tournament. They did, I think it was like a process or a docuseries video that kind of just like teased him. That's something we've heard rumblings of, and I think Hex even did a Ego Chall podcast with Karma talking about him potentially helping out. And now it's official, but I do want to just preface that there is absolutely no way that Karma could have come in and done anything to cause this result at Major 5. Like, I would just refuse to believe that anything like that is possible, to have a team go from dominating online 5-0 to not winning a map at a major because of a coach. So I just want to get that out of the way. There's just no shot that happened.
Yeah.
But it is worth mentioning that he did officially join. We don't know for sure like how long behind the scenes he was helping leading up to this, so that's another element that you can't really judge. But I am extremely interested to see what he is able to do now, especially based on how they performed at this major, to try to turn things around heading into champs. Because like you said, just all momentum is halted. They looked so good in the last couple of online stages, and even at the last 2 majors, because they made it to the grand finals, they just weren't able to lift the trophy at the end. So this is just a completely surprising result. Florida historically now, I believe, according to Breaking Point, Florida's 5-2 versus OpTic on land since Vanguard. There have been memes and jokes about Florida, but like that really puts it into context. It was like kind of just unbelievable. Especially when you take into consideration how good both of those franchises have been since the last couple of years. So,
yeah.
Just the fact they didn't win a single map, but obviously, you only play 2 series and only 6 maps in total, so it's not a big sample size, but that just kind of stands out to me too. And they didn't get I don't want to say cookie cutter matchup, but that's really the best way to describe a first round matchup in the loser bracket with London. Although London did get a win at this one, you would think if OpTic dropped down to play a team like London as opposed to LA Thieves, that we're probably having a different conversation about OpTic's performance at this tournament. But just very surprising result. Obviously, got to go back to the lab and work on some things now heading into champs, which I don't think they'll have any problem doing that. It's just going to be a matter of figuring out. I mean, yeah, I feel like you just got to basically. I mean, it might not even be worth watching any of the VOD from this tournament based on how the team feels about how they performed. So it might just be a case of, completely wipe this from the memory bank and start fresh heading into champs. But yeah, very surprising out of OpTic, especially like you kind of mentioned, just based on how much we were essentially saying OpTic were the best team in the game heading into this tournament. And they certainly proved us wrong.
So Ghosty said he tweeted after this the LAT series, so after they got knocked out, he said GG's to Florida LAT, sickest I've been in a long time, but that's no excuse for this weekend. Gotta lock it in for champs. And Ghosty's stats for these two series, so 6 maps, obviously make bold claims based on these 6 maps, but he was 0.51 hardpoint KD, 0.43 search and destroy KD, and 0.91 control KD, which was second best on the team. I mean, like, I don't know what to really make of it. It's kind of like when NBA players like come out after they get eliminated from the playoffs and they said they were dealing with an injury. It's like, okay, like I don't know what to do with this. Like I'm not gonna throw away that result like because you said you were sick or you had an injury. I hope he feels better. Like I'm not like being cold to him or anything, but I also just like don't know. Like he wasn't the only one that was playing poorly. If it was just him, if he was dropping like 0.5s and everybody else was kind of on par with the performances that we come to expect, then I could be like, okay, like yeah, it's probably just him, probably just an isolated case. But Hook was not very good either. He had a 0.61 control KD, which was the lowest on the team. He had a 0.47 search KD, which was just 0.04 better than Ghosty. And he had the second worst hardpoint KD at 0.69. Like
it is worth mentioning just real quick. I don't want to cut you off, but
yeah.
that is literally 2 maps in each of those modes. So.
Exactly. But I just wanted to point out that it wasn't like Ghosty was kind of like the only player on OpTic that had poor numbers, and obviously when you lose 6 maps, in 3 of those to Florida, who obviously like they did well compared to what they've been doing, but they still got 3-0'd by Minnesota after this. They got 3-0'd by New York. Like they didn't have a great performance like overall throughout this major, so it's very hard to kind of know what's going on in the OpTic camp. Like, is this all just based on an illness that Ghosty says he has, or like is this actually like something to be concerned about? And I'm on the side of like it's probably something to be a little concerned about. Maybe this isn't like DEFCON 1 and like the hex quarters are just like on fire, they're freaking out about it, but also, like, this was a very good chance to get the number 1 seed, to, I think most importantly, get momentum, figure out some things, play against FaZe, play against, they did get to play against LAT, but play against, like, some of the best teams in the league, get more experience against those teams, maybe figure out some maps that you haven't been able to really get as great a practice on. And they just didn't do that. Like they got beat by Florida, they got beat by LAT. Like 6 maps isn't a great. It's really like a waste of time to go to Toronto at that point. Like it was, you did as well as Seattle did, or no, Seattle played 3 maps, so not as great. But it's just a really poor performance and very shocking. We wouldn't be doing this like segment or whatever. We wouldn't be talking about this the same way if this was another team. Like if this was Vegas, like we talked about it last major with Vegas, but it was like just disappointing because of like they had a chance to do something great, not because we thought Vegas was like a championship contender or anything. And the same if like Minnesota had gotten knocked out in back-to-back 3-0s. Like it wouldn't be like, oh my god, like what happened? OpTic, I think we both expected. We literally did like an OpTic pick and a non-OpTic pick for last week. We both fully expected OpTic to walk away from Toronto as major champions, and they just didn't even come close. And I'm very curious to see why, because the Ghosty midseason pickup looked like game changing. Like OpTic had been kind of like they obviously won major one last season in Texas, but overall they've been like, just kind of missing something. They haven't been able to get over the hump, and I thought we were getting there with OpTic because they had gotten back-to-back seconds, 5-0 in qualifiers, number 1 seed heading into Major 5, and everything kind of got wiped out this weekend. Just really disappointing, and I'm sure the Green Wall feels pretty similar in that regard. Anything you have to say about OpTic before we move on?
No, I think we kind of touched on it. It's really like we're kind of both saying. It's just, even though this is an 06 map count for them, and that's just literally the worst performance you could statistically have at a tournament. It's just really small sample size, so it's really hard to gauge. And that's kind of, I think if I was on the team, I think that would be my mindset. It's kind of just like, okay, we just gotta forget everything that happened at this tournament and try to move on. Successfully doing that is another story entirely, so it definitely will be interesting to see how OpTic responds and how they bounce back at champs, if they are in fact able to bounce back. But kind of like I said earlier, I think if, again, we don't know exactly how long Karma's been helping or anything like that, but let's just say, for the sake of this segment, that he had just started helping literally right before this major. I am interested to see what he is able to do to try to help the squad improve, just because he's one of the best minds in competitive Call of Duty history. So, and I think JP did a really good job holding down the fort and, helping the squad continue to perform well after the whole Dashy Rambo situation earlier in the season. So, they got the talent, they got some good minds behind the scenes helping them out. Just going to be interesting to see how they're able to respond from this at the biggest tournament of the year.
Let's talk about LAT because they are obviously going to champs. They won Major 4, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep.
I couldn't remember if it's Major 3 or Major 4. But they won Major 4, going to champs. They had a horrendous qualifier period. I think they went 1-4, and obviously started in the losers bracket. They ended up obviously playing OpTic in the losers bracket round 1, which is pretty crazy. They ended up sweeping them. LAT sweep London, which is, obviously, we didn't even expect London to get there, so it, is a pretty big win. And then they lose to Toronto 3-0. Anything that you saw this past week about LAT, and what do you think, they built any momentum heading into champs?
Not necessarily, because it's kind of hard to say they built momentum with a top 6 finish in comparison to winning the tournament before this. But I just think it's just scary how similar the comparison between Toronto and LA Thieves is at this point now. From Toronto winning Major 3, going 1-4 in the Major 4 qualifiers, then they win 2 lower bracket round matches, I believe, to get top 6 at Major 4. LA Thieves win Major 4, go 1-5 or 1-4 in the Major 5 qualifiers, then they win 2 rounds to get top 6 at that major, despite, because, a top 6 in a 12-team tournament isn't the best placing, but it's technically in the top half. So I don't know how you feel about it, but it is just kind of, I know it is purely coincidental, but it is just super strange in my head how similar those two storylines played out in terms of the teams, in this case Toronto Major 3, LA Thieves Major 4, following up their major victory in almost identical poor fashions. So that it's really hard for me to, because when we were talking about Toronto, it was kind of maybe they were just struggling online, and something's going on with, the facility and all that stuff. And then, you go to LAT and it's like, oh, maybe, they're struggling online because they're playing from the West Coast, yada, yada, all that stuff. You can try to make excuses, but I think both teams are just better on land end of the day. And I think both teams have the potential to go on a run at champs, and especially based on performance this weekend. Toronto maybe more so than Thieves, but I don't think you can count out the Thieves just based on their performance end of last season, and they did win a tournament literally a month ago. So definitely a weird spot to be in. And it's even a little more weird because the team that kicked Thieves out of this tournament is who they're going to face in the first round of champs. So plenty of film for them to study. And it's a very familiar match that they literally will have had 2 weeks prior to meeting in the first round of champs. So I'm, like I said earlier, I'm really excited to see that showdown again. And I think whichever team does lose that could be in a position to go on another New York-esque loser bracket run at champs, depending on how the bracket shakes out.
Yeah, I was going to say it's very fitting that they are together again, basically, and they will have the chance to knock each other into the losers bracket at champs and, maybe make a run. So it's pretty fitting that we're getting to that point. I don't want to just gloss over Florida and London, but I'm going to gloss over Florida and London so we can talk about a team that I'm very, very sad about, the Las Vegas Legion, top 8 performance. So they did get some money out of it, 10 grand, if that's any consolation. They did get 10 CDO points. So they got something, to kind of, hang their hat on, I guess. But, ultimately they needed 30 CDL points at this major to qualify for champs. After beating the Seattle Surge, so they lose to FaZe 3-0 in the winners bracket, drop down the losers bracket. They beat the Seattle Surge, giving them some hope because it had Seattle won. Obviously, Seattle would have clinched their spot. But with the victory over the Surge, the Legion needed to finish, I believe it was the top 4. They needed to basically get into losers bracket semis, if I'm not mistaken, to officially confirm a spot at champs and take away Seattle's spot, which had to be just like frightening for Revan and the Surge, that they had their shot at getting a spot just by beating Vegas, but they lose to Vegas and they're like, oh my god, like if we would have to watch them win 2 more matches and take away our spot, like that would have been kind of heart-wrenching for them. It didn't end up happening. Vegas ended up losing to New York. Kind of unfortunate to run into the major champions in the losers bracket like that, but they just didn't have it. Like the online Vegas is kind of a different beast than the LAN Vegas, in my opinion. Like they looked fine against Seattle, but they were no match for Atlanta, New York, and just like what you said last week, if you want to get to champs, be one of the top 8 teams, like you're going to have to beat some of these teams. Like you're going to have to play some of these teams. And if they had gotten top 8 or if they had gotten into the top 8, they probably would have been playing FaZe in round 1 of the major. Or maybe they would have played OpTic. Like it would have been a very tough round 1 matchup for them regardless. And it just didn't happen. It was pretty gutting to see Clayster. He was obviously understandably upset. So were a lot of the Legion guys. But I like to be a little more positive because we've been quite negative about Vegas for a little bit just because they've been falling short. They finished 18-21 on the season. So they won 46% of their matches this season. They finished 20 points behind 8th place, so 20 points away from champs. If you look at how they did last season, like there's no comparison really. They had the worst season in CDL history. So they went 18-21 this season. They were 2-23 last season. They won 8% of their matches. And they were like, it wasn't like they were together with another team. Like every other team was hovering over 40% or around 50%, and they were at 8% win percentage. The turnaround has been remarkable. It's got to be one of the biggest turnarounds in CDL history. Maybe Seattle did that, like between season 2 and season 3. I can't remember, but it's kind of on par with that. Obviously, without a champs appearance, fair play to him. Like honestly, Clayster has been incredible for the organization. Temp, like it can't be overstated. I keep using overstated in this pod, and it's annoying me now, but Temp was a part of that roster last season that went 2-23. He was the best part of that roster. It was quite clear. He stayed. They gave him another chance. He gave them another chance, and they were almost able to do something special. They actually had the same record as Seattle did, but the major placings is what pretty much swung it in Seattle's favor. They also had the same number of wins as Boston, but again, still the major placings play a bigger factor in it than the online stuff. I'm tired of talking, but like you obviously are kind of like the flag bearer of the Vegas is Winning Champs crew. You're a founding member, so like I kind of want to get your thoughts on what you thought of Vegas, this major and kind of this season as a whole.
Yeah, I think Vegas is Winning Champs crew is down bad, but realistically, I think Clay, for lack of better terms, might have said something or tweeted something similar to what I'm about to say, but it was kind of along the lines of like they dug their own grave and they're gonna lay in it now. Yeah. So it's unfortunate results for fans of the franchise. But I do think, there was that breaking point survey that was brought up a couple weeks ago now, I think, talking about, Vegas surprisingly being in the upper half of fandoms and stuff. And that could be the Clayster effect, longtime veteran, very popular player in his own right. But regardless of all that, I think, in comparison to last year, the Paris/Vegas franchise has to be happy with the direction they're at least trending in. We can go back and look at Major 4 as just a missed opportunity for Vegas this year. We can also look, I'm pretty sure you mentioned it in the past, like their record against the other teams that weren't at champs, like the bottom 4 was just really bad. So I think that's the best way to really analyze this is, it would have been such a cool storyline if they were able to go on this loser bracket run here to try and get that final championship spot. But, they had their opportunities all throughout the season. They just weren't able to capitalize on them at the end of the day. And I mean, you even if they somehow did beat New York, which like you said, they beat them in the qualifiers online, if they were able to get through them, here they have a match against Florida, and like I was just saying, like I don't think they had a great record against Florida this year. So that's a tougher match than you would probably expect. Maybe momentum is on their side though after winning against New York. Who knows? End of the day, it didn't happen now, so it doesn't really matter. But yeah, Vegas had opportunities and they put themselves in a position to potentially make champs, and it just didn't work out. So definitely going to be interesting to see what they do in the off season. Would be really cool. Obviously, I am now with Skunk gone, dreading the day that Clay retires a little bit more. So I'm hopeful that isn't news we get in this off season. I'm not sure if Vegas will want to keep him, or what Vegas will do, because it always seems like we don't really know what Vegas is doing in the offseason until the very last minute. So could be an interesting one. But I think I think the best way to look at it is, there were some missed opportunities, but it's definitely for a franchise perspective, it is it is marked improvement here for the squad. As a Browns fan yourself, rooting for a team that has the worst record in the league, and then just a couple years ago beating the Steelers in the first round of the playoffs.
That was my Super Bowl. So,
so the Vegas didn't get there yet. So maybe next year they get a first round win at champs, or actually making champs would be a big win for the Vegas is Winning Champs crew. But we're just gonna have to see how the offseason shakes out for them now, and would be interesting. I think Clay tweeted like he's gonna take a couple days off and
Mm-hmm.
potentially turn the stream on for like Diablo 4 or something.
Yeah.
I would be interested to see how watch parties do on his stream, just because he's so popular. I don't think he would have Scump or Zuma numbers, but if you told me he was third behind those two for watch party numbers, I wouldn't necessarily be surprised. The bigger thing there is if we're in a world now where potentially he does do a watch party for champs and it is very successful, does that sway his decision in terms of whether he continues to compete or if he retires? I don't know. But that'll definitely be something interesting to watch and potentially for us to talk about in the coming months.
Yeah, he said that he would take a little bit of time. Obviously, it's the off season for him now, so like he's kind of afforded a little bit of time, especially as the champs happens and the season finishes up. But I know that he said he's been dealing with a lot, obviously this year, like the death of his sister, and like even just within the game and within the CDL, like to be kind of like an underdog and always be chasing eighth place, chasing a champ spot this entire season. That's got to be really draining. Obviously this isn't like a physical sport or anything, but mentally, I'm sure it wears on you to like have all those ups and downs. Obviously, the majors have been, very disappointing for them, and that's you need some time away to kind of get your breath back, essentially, to catch your breath and figure out what your next move is. I did want to say I tweeted it, and it's kind of like plunging the knife into Vegas fans, but there are two instances that I think, like, obviously they needed two more match wins to get into champs, and they had perfect opportunities, at least two off the top of my head. They played Florida at Major 4 in the losers bracket. They went to Game 5. They went to round 11 after being up 5-2 against the Mutineers in that search, and they lost Game 5, round 11, got knocked out, 0 points at that major. And then in the Major 5 qualifiers, I think it was maybe their first match of the qualifiers, they were up 2-1 in the series against OpTic, obviously the team that had just finished second, 5-0 in the previous qualifiers. They lose the second hard point in that series. They lose Game 5, round 11 to OpTic, and that is pretty much their season. Those two missed opportunities are gigantic in hindsight, obviously, for Vegas. But on a positive note, like what you said, this is an improvement, and Vegas, or the Legion franchise, needed improvement. I think the Browns comparison is very apt, obviously, because the Browns went 0-16 in 2016, something like that, and then they won, I think, like 4 or 5 games the next year. They ended up going to the playoffs, beating the Steelers. Again, like I said, that's like my Super Bowl, because I don't remember a Browns playoff game. I know they did when I was like younger, but I don't remember ever watching a Browns playoff game. So seeing that was incredible. Obviously, a little bit different now with the Browns. Like, it's kind of hit or miss what's going to happen. But I think it's important for these franchises, and not just for Vegas. We saw it with Seattle. It's important to take these steps. Like, you can't just go from the cellar dweller, basically. You can't go from the worst team in the league to the best team in the league. Like, it's very rare to do that. So you're going to have to go from worst team in the league to the ninth team in the league, or obviously it would have been nice to be the 8th, but you get to 9th, you're very close. Next year maybe you'll get a champ spot. That is another improvement, and you kind of build off of that. So at least there is some foundation for Vegas. Maybe they keep Standy. Obviously he didn't have a ton of time with this Legion lineup, but definitely an overall good season for the Legion, despite missing champs and being a disappointing end. I don't want to keep harping on anything, so like we'll probably run through some of these other teams. Boston, not a great, we should probably just mention that they are trying to pick up someone heading into champs. Snoopy is his name. He's a challengers player with the Boston Academy team. There are questions about like how they would do this, considering the rosters were locked, or so we thought, I guess, heading into Major 5. report, according to the rotation on Twitter, that they're trying to replace Vivid with Snoopy, who Snoopy's like an 18-year-old Mexican player, and I guess he's really really good, playing on the Breach Academy roster. I don't know how they're gonna do this. Like I don't really have any details. I'm very interested to see what happens because this seems like this shouldn't be allowed to happen. I personally think you're like whatever roster you play with at Major 5, that's the exact same roster you should have to play with at Champs, just as like a personal thing. Like, if there's like a sickness, an illness or whatever, and that one of the players can't play, yeah, like let them have an emergency substitute. But I'm personally not okay with Vivid getting dropped, after finishing the regular season, like going into Champs. I think that's kind of scummy. I understand why Boston would do it, because if they think Snoopy is an upgrade, like they were really bad. Like the fact that they lost to London at this majors, like that was horrible for them. I don't think you saw the Snoopy stuff, so you obviously aren't a big an avid viewer of challengers. But if you have any thoughts on that, or we could just kind of wrap up. Obviously, we didn't really talk about London. Congrats to them. They won a match at the last tournament of the season. Like that's awesome for them. Like unironically, the fans were very happy. I believe it was Brycey and Tun on the call for that match. So the two English broadcasters also got to cast London's final win of the season. Seattle, obviously horrible, 3-0 against Vegas, but they got the champ spot, so that's really all that mattered. LAG, at least it's over. Like, that's probably the bright side. It's been a horrific season, and I don't envy those players. Like, they probably dealt with a lot of crap this season with all of the behind the scenes, like the organization kind of collapsing mid-season and everything that happened with that. So, nothing, I'm not going to say anything bad about those guys. Like, just this season was pretty bad, and I'm sure they're glad that it's over and they could kind of move on and put this in the rear view. Any thoughts on Boston, London, Seattle, LAG as we kind of wrap up the show?
Yeah, just real quick, I think that Boston stuff is interesting. Obviously, we'll have to wait and see how it plays out. I kind of made a joke before today, a couple days ago, that after Boston's performance, it would have been ultimate storyline things if they decided to bring in Doug for a champs run, and then they win champs, and Doug gets his ring, and that's maximum storyline potential right there. But obviously, a change. I wasn't actually thinking they were going to make a change, so it will be interesting to see how that shakes up. I don't think he's been playing for that long in Challengers. I'm pretty sure he was like a more recent pickup for Boston, like but I know Doug has kind of been singing his praises, so it'll be interesting to see how it works out if that move does come to fruition. But it just feels like there's like a roster carousel right now of on Boston over the last couple of months. For London, like you said, not really much to talk about. It was cool. Asim is from Canada, I believe, so he got to win in front of his family and stuff, so that was pretty neat. But not much else to say there. LAG, kind of like you said, potentially, is this the last time we ever see LAG competing in the CDL? Is it going to be a rebrand of a franchise sale? We don't really know. Is worth mentioning Denver Nuggets, owned by Kroenke, is in the NBA Finals now. If they win the NBA Finals, does that change any decisions potentially being made on the esports side of things? I don't really think so, but we don't actually know. Like, there's never been an official statement on those potential changes or selling, so weird spot. Could potentially be the last time we ever see LAG in the CDL, though. And Seattle, really surprising, just considering, we've talked about the roller coaster seesaw, all the analogies for Seattle over the last couple of years now. I think the one stat that was pretty surprising to me, Breaking Point. According to Breaking Point, Seattle is 1-8 in round 11 this year. If you really think about it, there were a ton of moments in my head that I go back to in the Vanguard year where obviously Seattle won. They won the tournament. I think they got third at champs last year, if I remember correctly. They
I
they,
believe
they
so,
were
yeah.
consistently getting top placings regardless, and they did have, like we said, roller coaster seesaw, some downward slopes, but I feel like last year there were a lot of Iceman accuracy moments in Search and Destroy, especially ninja diffuses, and I can remember Brian Saint tweeting the Jesse Pinkman gift from Breaking Bad, like, he can't keep getting away with this. And
Mhm.
they're 1-8 in round 11s this year. We really haven't seen those moments out of accuracy and Seattle as a whole. So the 1-8 is a little deceiving. Well, I can't really say a little deceiving, but it always just in my head, I think about Seattle in round 11, the round 11 against FaZe, where on Embassy Simp gets the 2-piece and the 2v3, and that could completely change the narrative of potentially both teams, their momentum, all that stuff. But it just went FaZe's way in that round. But obviously, if you have a 1-8 record, that one round 11 isn't changing much if it was 2-7 potentially. But yeah, I think Seattle has to be, um, just based on the talent on that roster, to be in a position where you get first rounded at this tournament and then have to have your fate of potentially either your season being over or you continue playing being in another team's hands. That has to feel weird for them, just with how good that squad can be. And I feel like it has to be a wake up call for them to try and go hard for this last tournament. Not saying they weren't going hard or anything like that. Um, but they have a tough first round matchup. They've played FaZe really tough this year and in years prior. So who knows, when all the chips are on the table, how it plays out. But obviously they didn't do themselves any favors with their performance at this major. So I guess we're either going to see if this is the seesaw going back up or the roller coaster going back up, or if they're crashing to end the season here.
Yeah. Really bad the back half of the season for them. They got second at Major One and just have been kind of downhill from there. Like, they kind of spiked up a little bit, but it's just been really bad. Obviously, we talked about the Pred stuff, like how OpTic wanted to buy him out or get him on their roster somehow earlier this season, and there was like a lot of debate about like whether they should or should not do that, and kind of not scrap the season, but kind of push aside some of their championship ambitions. And now it looks like, not impossible, obviously, because they made champs, but it looks very improbable that they will win a championship. And I mean, OpTic's probably a little bit happy that it didn't work out because it's been pretty good for them, aside from this past weekend. But it's interesting how that was a story, and now Seattle are, facing FaZe, which they've been able to beat FaZe more often than a lot of other teams in the CDL over the past few years, but it feels a lot different now heading into champs this time around. But yeah, that does it for Major 5. I'll just quickly go through the standings so we can kind of get an overview as we end the regular season. This is the last regular season pod. We will discuss obviously champs next week and kind of, or maybe not. I don't know what we're doing. Just don't hold me to anything. But we are kind of entering champ season and the most important tournament of the year. The 2023 CDL season standings are as follows: Atlanta FaZe at 1. OpTic Texas at 2, New York Subliners at 3, Toronto Ultra at 4, LAT at 5, Minnesota 6, Boston 7, Seattle Surge 8, the Las Vegas Legion at 9, Florida Mutineers 10, LAG 11, and at 12th place, the London Royal Ravens. Obviously, the top 8 going to champs. The bottom 4, their season is over. They can start their off season, kind of go to Cancun, as is the NBA meme. I don't know if the COD players do that as much, but they could go to Cancun if they want. The Pick'em records, it really tightened up this weekend. I think it was New York. I picked New York in the grand finals, which really helped. And I think there were a few other, maybe Minnesota I picked over Florida, but and I did not believe in the Vegas is winning champ stuff. I was actually kind of trying to reverse jinx them a little bit, but it also felt kind of hopeless a little bit as well. But yeah, I am just one match back from you in the pick'em. You went 10-8 at Major 5. I went 13-5. So you are 127-89 for the season. I'm 126-90. So it will come down to champs. I will have to pick at least one if we tied, but we'll have to have some differing picks at some point, and I'm sure we will naturally at the final event of the year. But it's been a fun regular season. It's kind of flown by at times. It's very weird that we are literally not even into June yet, and we're like, "Yep, it's champs time. We're ready to talk about champs." But it's coming up, and we're gonna have a lot to talk about. I'm not sure what the plan is for how we deal with this, because next week is an off week. There's nothing to really talk about, and then or there is a lot to talk about, but there's no matches or anything. And then the following week is when champs starts. We're gonna do 2 episodes. We're gonna do episodes each week. I'm just trying to figure out what the best idea is for like how to break it up. I don't remember what we did last season, because I'm still COVID brain, like 3 years in, and I'm still it's hard to even remember what I had for lunch today. So I'm not gonna try to think about what we did for content last year around this time. But we'll figure it out. Tune in next week. We will definitely be here and talking about COD and in some shape or form. Maybe we'll have some clear picture of what Boston's doing with their roster. And I mean, if you're going to make a roster change, have Doug go to OpTic. Maybe he can turn the thing around and lead them to a championship, which would, I mean, Crimsix would be losing his mind at that point, just watching Doug win a world title with OpTic. But yeah, that does it for us. Unless Bink has anything else, make sure to subscribe, follow the podcast feed wherever you're listening or watching on. Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, YouTube. Again, thank you guys so much for the support that we've been seeing across many platforms, but specifically YouTube. It's been very wild to see how much the channel has been kind of, relatively popping off for us when we're not really, trying to, we're not the flank, we're not any of those, but it's been incredible that you guys have been supporting us as much as you have been. Make sure you give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts. Follow us on Twitter at jbink with 2 Ks, at Preston Byers. Podcast Twitter at Ego Chall Podcast. And like I said, we'll be back next week to talk about something, Call of Duty related, and maybe to be a shorter show than usual. But yeah, champs. We're in champs mode at the moment, and that's kind of our only focus as we close in on the end of the season. But yeah, that does it for me. Bing, take it away.
Yeah, I promised a brief champs preview in my tweet. So just to set the stage a little bit for potentially our next show, the bracket is as follows. The 1 versus 8 matchup is FaZe versus Surge. 4 versus 5 is Ultra versus Thieves. 2 versus 7 is OpTic versus Boston, and then 3 versus 6 is New York, Minnesota. So that's FaZe, Surge, Ultra, Thieves in the top half of the bracket, OpTic, Boston, New York, Rocker in the lower half. Obviously, it's only an 8-team bracket, is double elim. But yeah, just wanted to throw those matchups out there. We've already talked about some of them indirectly, especially Ultra versus Thieves, and then kind of previewed FaZe versus Seattle a little bit, just talking about the history there. But it is interesting if Boston does decide to make some type of move, potentially Snoopy's first CDL matchup is against OpTic at champs. You kind of, even if OpTic is coming off a dismal performance at Major 5, that's kind of like potentially the toughest on paper matchup you can have for your CDL debut. So it'll be interesting to see how that all shakes out. I guess we'll talk to you guys more next week, potentially on that, if there's any news over the next couple days, all that good stuff. So yeah, like Preston said, that we'll get more into champs next week. Just a little preview there. But with the Major 5 stuff. Hope you guys enjoyed that tournament. Really exciting one. Obviously, highlighted all that stuff if you weren't able to watch it. And if you weren't, probably go back and watch potentially the New York and Toronto matchups and the grand finals. Were all pretty good matchups. So, till next time, thank you guys as always for the support and tuning in. And remember to send the chow.